They called them the female eunuchs, and on a day in April 1421, the Forbidden City was filled with the sound of 3,000 of them dying. It wasn't a quick end with a clean strike of steel. This was a drawn-out extermination, hour after hour, blow after blow, bamboo rods rising and falling until the sun dipped low. By the time evening shadows stretched across the courtyard, the stones were so drenched in blood that later architects advised replacing them entirely. Yet perhaps the most haunting part wasn't the killing itself, but the absolute silence that followed. The Imperial record-keepers moved in swiftly, not to document the horror, but to erase it, wiping out an entire generation of palace women from the official scrolls, as if they had never drawn breath. A slaughter on such a scale is never random. It points to something deeply rotten at the heart of power. So what could have unfolded behind the sealed walls of the Forbidden City to justify this level of annihilation? Why were these women given such a strange title? And what secret was so dangerous that the Emperor preferred to butcher nearly 3,000 of his own attendants, then scrub their names from history, rather than let the truth slip? To understand how murder could be woven into palace routine, we have to go back to the very moment when girls first heard the recruitment drums echo through their villages. The sound rolled down dusty streets like a warning wrapped in ceremony. Mothers clutched their 13-year-old daughters tighter, knowing this might be the last time they'd ever see them. Every 3 years, this ritual swept across China. The palace needed fresh bodies to feed its endless machinery. At its height, over 22,000 people worked within the imperial walls, most of them female. The numbers were as cold as they were cruel. From across the empire, 5,000 girls were selected. Then, through a series of carefully designed trials, 4,700 would be discarded. Only 300 were chosen, the ones who had been most perfectly broken. In the spring of 1407, a young girl named Chan stood in a long line with nearly 1,000 others, all between 13 and 15 years old. A high-ranking eunuch paced slowly along the row, his silk shoes barely whispering against the flagstones. Every 10th girl made him pause. He would tilt her face toward the light, check her teeth as if she were livestock at market, measure her shoulders with a painted wooden rod. The air was thick with the sound of weeping, not from the girls, who had been warned that tears would mean instant rejection, but from the mothers pressed against the outer gates. When the first round of eliminations came, 700 girls in Chen's group were dismissed at once. Too tall, too short, too beautiful, not beautiful enough. The palace recruiters had to meet quotas, but they also had exacting standards. A palace maid was expected to be pleasing enough not to offend royal eyes, but plain enough not to tempt them, a delicate balance that would surprise even the most hardened slave trader. They tested for body odor by locking the girls in sealed rooms for hours. They judged their voices by forcing them to recite poetry until their throats were raw. They examined feet, hands, even the way a girl breathed in her sleep. The second stage was worse. Intelligence tests designed so that most would fail. Memory challenges where a girl had to repeat complex instructions after hearing them only once. Physical endurance trials that forced them to stand motionless for 6 hours, carry heavy jugs of water up endless flights of stairs, or hold painful postures until their muscles trembled. Chin watched girl after girl collapse, only to be dragged away by guards. No one really knows what happened to the thousands who were turned away. Some say they were sold to brothels. Others believe they were simply sent home to families who no longer wanted daughters marked by imperial rejection. The truth likely varied depending on the region and the year, but one thing was certain: rejection was a social death sentence. By the third day, only 300 girls remained from Chen's original 1,000. They had survived every cut, proven their strength, and displayed the exact balance of skill and submission the palace demanded. Officials declared them chosen for imperial glory. None of them realized they had just lost everything. That night, the new recruits were loaded onto covered carts. Goodbyes were not permitted. Families were told that farewells might disturb the girls' mental preparation for service. Chen could hear her mother's cries fading as the cart rattled away. Around her, the others sat in tense silence. A few prayed. Most stared into the dark, already beginning to learn the first rule of palace survival. Silence was safety. The journey to the capital took weeks. At every stop, their handlers reminded them of their supposed good fortune. They would eat better than their families ever had. They would see wonders beyond the reach of any peasant. They would serve the Son of Heaven himself. But Chen noticed something strange. None of the handlers ever looked directly into their eyes, nor did they use their names. Already, the girls were being trained to vanish, and once they passed through those towering palace gates, they would discover that even their own thoughts no longer belonged to them. The first word they stole from her was the simplest in any language: I. On her first morning inside the Forbidden City, the new arrivals were summoned to a dim, windowless chamber. The head matron stood waiting, a woman whose pale skin and unfocused eyes told of decades lived under palace discipline. Every movement she made was precise, almost rehearsed, as if she'd been practicing for a lifetime. When she spoke, it was barely louder than a whisper, yet her voice reached every corner of the room. From this moment forward, she said, you no longer have a self. The word I is forbidden. The word me is forbidden. Mine does not exist. Instead, the girls were taught a new way to speak, one that erased them from their own sentences. They were to say things like, this unworthy servant begs permission to eat. This lowly one requests rest. This insignificant slave has soiled herself and awaits punishment. Every reference to the self had to be wrapped in humility and degradation before it could be spoken aloud. Mistakes were met with swift punishment. A bamboo switch snapped across the throat if someone dared to say, I think, or I want. By the end of the week, Chen overheard the girl beside her mumbling in her sleep, practicing the required phrases even in her dreams. This worthless body, this worthless body, this worthless body. But stripping away their words was only the beginning. They were not allowed to own anything, not even the clothes they wore. They did not own their time. Every second of the day was dictated and supervised. They did not own space. Their sleeping quarters could be changed without warning. They weren't even allowed to own their memories. Part of their training involved rewriting their pasts. They were made to repeat versions of their lives in which their families had, generously, offered them to the palace as an honor. Any personal history that contradicted the official story was erased through repetition and fear. The matrons liked to ask trap questions. What does this servant think of the morning meal? Any answer that revealed an opinion, even about food, earned punishment. The correct response was always to deflect. This unworthy one accepts what the palace provides. Even dreams were considered dangerous. Girls who talked in their sleep were interrogated about their visions. Dreams of home, of family, of freedom were labeled acts of rebellion against the mind's obedience. Chen quickly learned to empty her thoughts before closing her eyes at night, to think only of black silk and nothing else. She watched others break under the strain. One morning, a girl named Lin accidentally used I when asking for water. The consequences would haunt survivors for decades, not just the 100 lashes with split bamboo, but the humiliation of being forced to kneel in the courtyard while every other trainee took turns condemning her selfishness. Those who failed to insult her with enough venom were beaten themselves. The palace had perfected this psychological machinery over centuries. They didn't need iron chains when the mind itself could be shackled. After 3 months, most of the girls no longer even thought in the first person. Their inner voices had shifted to the required third-person degradation. Chen caught herself thinking, "This servant is hungry," instead of simply, "I'm hungry." Some tried to resist in small ways. They would touch their own faces in the dark, trying to remember the feeling of being a person. They would trace their names into the dust when no one was watching. But even these tiny acts of rebellion carried enormous risk. There were always informants among them, girls so thoroughly broken that they found purpose in reporting others. The final test came after 6 months. Each trainee was brought alone before a panel of senior matrons and asked a single question. "Who are you?" The only correct answer was complete silence. Anyone who spoke, even to recite a self-deprecating phrase, had failed, because she still believed she existed enough to deny it. Only those who responded with absolute emptiness were allowed to move on. Chen passed without even realizing she had been asked a question. Her sense of self had been erased so completely that nothing inside her rose to answer. And for the palace, that was exactly the point. Once service began, the rules shifted from destroying the mind to reshaping the body. Chen spent hours walking backwards, her neck locked in a painful arch, dishes trembling in her outstretched arms, because turning her back on anyone of imperial blood was punishable by death. It didn't matter whether it was the emperor, his wives, or even the youngest prince who could barely crawl. To survive, they learned a choreography of submission that would twist their bodies into permanent damage. In the first week of her new role, Chan was taught the sideways shuffle for passing royalty in corridors, pressing so close to the wall that flakes of paint clung to her clothes. She mastered the backwards exit from a room, counting her steps to avoid collision. She practiced the dizzying spiral turn that ensured her face was always oriented toward her betters. And all of this had to be done while carrying out their work. Imagine balancing a bowl of boiling soup while walking backwards across polished stone, eyes craned to watch for obstacles, arms extended to keep the vessel far from imperial flesh. The kitchen staff even kept count of accidents. In the summer of 1413, one such accident killed 12 women in a single morning. A maid tripped while backing away from the empress, spilling scalding oil across a crowd of servants. Even in sleep, they were not free from the discipline. Those who served the inner palace had to rest in readiness positions, lying on their sides, facing the door, knees bent, prepared to spring into a backwards walk at a moment's notice. Senior maids conducted surprise inspections at night, beating anyone found sleeping naturally. Within months, Chen's body was changing. Her spine curved permanently from the constant backward lean. Her neck muscles seized into spasms. The sliding shuffle ruined the arches of her feet. Decades later, survivors could still be identified by their tilted heads and sideways gaits, moving like shadows of the discipline that had once governed their every step. The physical contortions of palace life were only the surface. The deeper horrors waited in the emperor's private chambers, where the choreography of submission demanded more than controlled movements. It required women to erase even the natural reactions of their own bodies. The physician's orders were meticulous. A palace maid chosen for the emperor or high-ranking princes was to breathe so quietly that no sound could be heard, let her eyes drift out of focus, and suppress every muscle response until she resembled nothing more than a warm, breathing corpse. Training began with breath control. Natural breathing was too loud, too alive. Hours were spent pulling air in through barely parted lips, keeping the chest still, forbidding the rise and fall of the ribs. They practiced until a supervisor could stand an arm's length away and detect no movement at all. Anyone whose breath betrayed her existence during service was punished immediately, not for disturbing the emperor's pleasure, but for daring to exist in his presence. Then came facial discipline. A face could reveal too much. Pain, pleasure, fear, disgust, all were forbidden. Trainers would throw ice water into a woman's face without warning. They would drive pins under fingernails. They would hold rotting meat under her nose after a moment of sweet perfume. Any flinch or grimace brought the cane or worse. until the face became a flawless mask of porcelain beauty without a spark of life. The eyes were the most dangerous. Closing them implied rejection. Focusing them suggested thought. The perfect gaze was one of seeing nothing and yet missing nothing, a strange, vacant openness. Those who failed to achieve it risked having their vision taken permanently, sometimes through blinding with hot needles, other times through drugging that left them in a fogged half-consciousness. The body, too, had to obey. Skin naturally warms or chills in reaction to touch, fear, or arousal. But here, those responses had to be smothered. The training involved moving from ice baths to steaming rooms while keeping skin temperature unchanged, a form of self-hypnosis that often killed 1 in 10 women through shock, frostbite, or heat stroke. And then came the real test, performing this living death during service. Chen saw women return from the emperor's chamber with an emptiness in their eyes that went beyond training. They had learned to slip out of their own bodies entirely, floating somewhere unreachable while the flesh did what it was told. Some never came back to themselves afterward. The palace doctors had their own chemical tools for those who couldn't achieve the state naturally. Lotus powder in wine created a soft dissociation. Poppy extracts dulled sensation. But these were dangerous. Too much, and the woman lost consciousness, which was unacceptable. The dosage had to leave her aware enough to move, but absent enough to be nothing. The aftermath was often worse than the act. Women who had succeeded in their performance would collapse afterward, bodies shaking violently as the suppressed reactions fought their way out. Some lay in their beds with mouths open in silent screams, too trained in muteness to make a sound. Others developed uncontrollable tremors from the muscle control required. For the physicians, this was all a clinical exercise. They recorded optimal breathing rates, muscle relaxation sequences, meditation patterns for suppressing consciousness. They didn't write of suffering, only of efficiency, as though the women were machines fine-tuned for stillness. Some maids found escape in complete mental fracture. They erased themselves so thoroughly that only the body remained, moving through tasks automatically, while the person who once lived inside was simply gone. These hollow-eyed figures were called the gone ones by other servants, bodies that walked and worked, but housed no one. Others fought to keep some tiny piece of self hidden away. They built mental hiding places, imagined rooms they could retreat to, memories they could replay, but even those safe spaces were under threat, because there was one function no woman could fully control, and in the Forbidden City it could mean her death, her monthly cycle. Missing it, even once, could bring an execution order. Chen counted the days in secret, marking them on the smooth underside of jade ornaments, on the legs of wooden beds, even on her own skin when no other surface was available. 28, 29, 30, and with every extra day, the dread grew heavier. Menstruation meant surveillance. Every palace maid was required to report the exact start and end of her cycle, the flow, any irregularities, to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Missing a report brought 50 bamboo strikes, but reporting too late, even by hours, could mean death. The reason was as ruthless as it was absurd. A late cycle might mean pregnancy, and any pregnancy not sanctioned by the emperor was considered treason against the bloodline. The rules left no room for error. Report too early, and you faced punishment for wasting the official's time. Report too late, and you faced the blade. The line between the two was measured in hours. Chen saw the signs of women spiraling into what the palace called cycle panic. The compulsive counting, the hidden scratches in wood and stone, the tightening fear that made every breath quicken. When a woman's cycle stopped entirely, whether from stress, malnutrition, or constant physical strain, the system showed no mercy. It was always assumed to be pregnancy, no matter the reality. Inspections followed, humiliating and invasive, often conducted in public courtyards so others could watch. palace doctors, always men, would probe with cold metal tools, and the violation was part of the punishment. One kitchen maid named Li, whose cycle had always been irregular, went 40 days without bleeding. She swore she'd never even been in the presence of a man, but that didn't matter. She received 100 bamboo strikes over 3 days. She survived, barely, but would never walk without a cane again. The cruel irony was that the palace itself often caused the irregularities it punished. Women bled less or not at all simply because their bodies were breaking down under the conditions. Yet the system never accounted for that. Some tried to force their cycles to return, drinking dangerous herbs, inserting sharp objects, even injuring themselves to produce blood on schedule. Many died of infection, their deaths quietly omitted from any record. The ministry kept meticulous archives of every woman's cycle, stored on wooden tablets, analyzing patterns, investigating irregularities, even watching for synchronized menstruation. To them, if women's cycles aligned, it might indicate secret meetings or emotional bonds, both forbidden. And for those who served in the inner palace, the scrutiny was even more relentless. These women endured monthly virginity inspections, in addition to cycle reporting, performed by elderly matrons whose roughness was meant to hurt as much as to examine. False accusations were common. A matron might claim a woman had missed a report even when she hadn't, forcing her into examination just to prove her innocence. The fear alone could throw off a woman's cycle, creating the very evidence the palace sought. Chan saw women break into tears of relief when cramps arrived, celebrating pain as a reprieve from execution. For those who didn't bleed in time, the nightmare that followed was worse than anything they'd yet endured, because if a woman was found pregnant without permission, the Forbidden City had special protocols, and mercy was not among them. For the women found to be pregnant without imperial sanction, the nightmare that followed was not an execution, at least not immediately. Instead, their bodies were taken as resources for the state. They would be made into wet nurses for royal infants. It was a sentence as cruel as it was calculated. The milk meant for their own newborns would be stolen to feed the children of the emperor. Their own babies would be left behind to starve. Inside the Forbidden City, the role of wet nurse was industrialized. Each imperial baby was assigned 40 women, not in rotation, but all feeding at once in carefully timed shifts. The logic was as cold as it was obsessive. Constant variety was thought to ensure the richest nutrition for the royal child. Selection began within days of childbirth. Inspectors would arrive at homes and hospitals, examining new mothers as if they were dairy cattle, checking milk flow, texture, taste, and the health of the mother. Those who passed were taken immediately. Their own infants were handed off to relatives or low-paid caregivers, who could not hope to match the nourishment of a mother's milk. The irony was vicious. Women chosen for their ability to provide perfect sustenance to the empire's most privileged children were forbidden to feed their own. Once inside the palace, wet nurses lived in quarters near the imperial nurseries. Every 3 hours, day and night, they were summoned in groups of 10, bare from the waist up, while supervisors monitored each feeding. Infants were passed from one woman to another like cups at a banquet, each baby sampling multiple sources to ensure quality and consistency. Chen, assigned briefly to assist in the nursery wing, saw the routine with her own eyes. The women were addressed only by numbers, their names erased. Their diets were rigid, special soups and grain pastes designed to maximize production. Any display of strong emotion was forbidden. Crying over their own children was punished, as it was believed sorrow could sour the milk. The toll outside the palace was catastrophic. Without their mother's milk, the wet nurse's own children died at shocking rates. 6 in every 10 never survived infancy. These deaths were not recorded, not mourned in the official record. The palace physicians believed in what they called essence transfer, a superstition that a wet nurse's personal qualities could be passed to the royal infant through her milk. This meant the women were also evaluated for their temperament, intelligence, and even beauty. A nurse deemed to have an undesirable trait, too quick to anger, too plain, too melancholic, was dismissed, her milk considered unfit. Standards shifted unpredictably with imperial whims. Some nurses were forced to undergo physical alterations. Inverted nipples were stretched through painful procedures, while those with low milk flow were injected with hormone extracts taken from animal glands. If grief over their own children caused the milk to dry up, the palace had ways to restart it. These included force feeding, strict confinement, and physical stimulation to trigger lactation. The psychological cruelty was just as deliberate. Palace guards were instructed to walk past the nursery windows with crying babies in their arms, allowing mothers to hear their own infants just out of reach. Some women broke completely under the sound. A few even risked smuggling their children inside to feed them in secret, acts that, if discovered, resulted in death for both mother and child. The scale of the system was staggering. A single wet nurse might provide 20,000 feedings during her service, adding up to hundreds of gallons of milk. Multiply that by 40 women per royal infant, and by the dozen or more imperial children alive at any time, and the picture becomes clear. Thousands of women's bodies turned into production units for the empire, their own families left to collapse. And this service did not exempt them from other duties. Between feedings, wet nurses scrubbed floors, mended garments, and prepared meals. Payment was meager: a bowl of thin soup, shared sleeping space, and the hollow promise that their surviving children might one day be given work in the palace. Some tried subtle rebellion. They ate forbidden foods to spoil the milk, pretended to be ill, or deliberately slowed their production. But the palace had answers for every defiance: forced diets, invasive medical inspections, and punishments for sabotage of imperial nutrition. Those who survived their term were often changed beyond repair. Some could not look their surviving children in the eye without seeing the royal infants they had been forced to prioritize. Others experienced constant milk leakage for years, their bodies trained into overproduction that would not stop. A few were spared this torment only by forgetting it entirely, their minds sealing away the memory like a wound too deep to touch. But the system ensured that the cruelty reproduced itself. The women in charge of supervising wet nurses had once been wet nurses themselves, broken and reshaped until they could inflict the same suffering on others without hesitation. They were called ants, senior maids who had survived decades in the palace and now ruled over the younger women with the same cruelty once inflicted on them. To the outside world, the title sounded gentle, even familial. Inside the Forbidden City, it meant something entirely different. The palace understood something chilling. The best enforcers were not outside guards, but survivors who knew the precise depth of pain each punishment could cause. These women carried the memories of their own suffering like a set of tools, ready to be applied to others. They remembered the crack of the bamboo rod, the ache of kneeling for hours on shards of porcelain, the cold humiliation of inspections, and they knew exactly how far they could push without killing their victim. Aunt Chen had entered the palace as a 13-year-old and now, 30 years later, commanded a section of junior maids. She had lived through every form of punishment the system devised. She could judge by a glance which blows would leave temporary welts and which would scar for life. She knew how many hours a body could endure a stress position before infection set in. But the transformation from victim to oppressor was never instant. It began small, with seemingly harmless responsibilities: distributing food portions, deciding sleeping arrangements, reporting minor infractions. Each new authority came with a choice: protect a friend and share her punishment, or sacrifice her to save yourself. Refuse to strike another girl, and you'd receive double the beating. Soon, survival demanded complicity. One day, Aunt Chen faced a trembling new maid who could have been her younger self. Same rural accent, same wide, frightened eyes. But empathy had become a luxury she couldn't afford. Mercy risked suspicion. Too much softness, and she could be accused of corruption, stripped of her privileges, and thrown back into the lowest ranks. The cruelest aunts were often the ones who had once been the kindest. They had learned that showing leniency was a quick route to destruction. The arithmetic of palace survival was simple. If someone had to suffer, better them than you. Many aunts developed punishments that mirrored their own past traumas. Those who had starved withheld food with deliberate malice. Women who had endured sexual abuse became relentless during virginity inspections. Mothers who had lost children enforced pregnancy protocols with merciless precision. They reproduced their own pain in others, maintaining the cycle that had shaped them. Some became notorious. One aunt reportedly beat 30 girls to death in a single year, not from clumsiness, but from calculated brutality. Her efficiency lay in knowing how to break a girl's spirit without creating martyrs. Dead maids needed replacing. Broken ones still worked and served as living warnings to the rest. The cruelty wasn't always physical. The most effective aunts mastered emotional manipulation. They would single out a girl for small acts of kindness, a softer word, a spared punishment, only to withdraw it suddenly, leaving the girl desperate to earn the affection back. This push and pull bound the younger women to their tormentors in a twisted imitation of loyalty. Some aunts even convinced themselves that their actions were for the juniors' own good. Better to learn hard lessons from someone who had survived, they told themselves, than to make fatal mistakes later. They repeated phrases as they beat girls. "This hurts me more than you," or "someday you'll thank me," echoes of the same words they had once heard through their own screams. In return for their service, the palace granted the most effective aunts small privileges: a private sleeping space, better food, or occasional permission to send messages to family. These scraps seemed like riches after decades of deprivation, but they came with strings. Any sign of mercy could see them stripped away instantly. The system made sure the price of kindness was always too high. For Aunt Chen, the deepest horror was realizing she felt relief when punishments were aimed at others. If the junior maids were beaten, it meant she wasn't. When new recruits arrived, it meant fresh targets for the palace's wrath, and a temporary reprieve for her section. She began to predict which girls would break first, steering attention toward them like a shield. This was the palace's ultimate victory, turning women against each other so completely that natural solidarity became impossible. Anyone might be tomorrow's enforcer or today's spy. Friendships were dangerous. Trust was a liability. By the time a woman became an aunt, her own humanity had been carved away as thoroughly as the juniors she now disciplined. She was living proof that the system could not only destroy individuals, but reshape them into weapons, victims transformed into the perfect instruments of oppression. The wooden rod struck her abdomen for the 40th time, and something inside tore loose. The palace called it discipline through adjustment, a polite phrase that disguised a system of deliberate internal mutilation designed to strip women of their ability to bear children while keeping them strong enough to work. Male eunuchs lost their reproductive capacity in a single surgical act. For the women, it came in stages, repeated assaults over years, each one adding new damage until the result was permanent. It began with preparation. The chosen woman was forced to drink wine laced with narcotics, lotus extract to fog the mind, poppy tears to dull sensation, and other herbs that induced a detached, floating state. The dosage was exact, enough to blunt resistance, but never enough to block the pain entirely. The palace wanted its victims conscious, able to remember every moment, yet too impaired to fight back effectively. Next came the positioning. She would be bound to a wooden frame, arms and legs stretched out, every joint secured to prevent movement. Senior matrons supervised, while the ones who delivered the blows were often younger women who had already endured the same adjustment themselves. The weapon was a smooth, rounded rod, as thick as a man's wrist, polished from generations of use. Striking required precision. Too high, and ribs could break, killing the victim. Too low, and the damage would be insufficient. The target was always the lower abdomen, unprotected by bone, where the reproductive organs lay vulnerable. For a first offense, 40 strikes were standard. Each repeated infraction increased the number by 20, until either the woman died or the intended sterility was achieved. Chen's first time witnessing an adjustment came in her 3rd year of service. The victim was a kitchen maid named Ming, punished for sending secret messages to her family. As correction for divided loyalty, she was sentenced to reproductive destruction. The sound was unforgettable, not the muffled screams, gagged by leather strips, but the wet, rhythmic thud of wood against flesh, like a drumbeat for cruelty. After the beating came the so-called healing. Ash from burned plants was mixed with coarse salt and packed against the bruised abdomen to draw out corruption. The mixture burned like acid. Women lay in isolation cells for days, bodies rigid with pain, while matrons checked for signs of internal bleeding. Survival rates were grim. Only 3 in 10 emerged without visible, disabling injuries, and those who did carried the hidden damage the palace wanted. The blows caused deep bruising that led to scarring of the reproductive organs. Fallopian tubes became blocked. The uterus shifted out of place, creating constant pain and ensuring pregnancy was impossible. In some cases, internal organs even prolapsed, shifting permanently from their normal positions. The palace doctors recorded these outcomes clinically, noting successful correction when infertility was achieved. They praised cases where women could still work but were now incapable of breeding contamination into the Imperial line. But the after-effects were far worse than the physical. Some women developed extreme aversions to touch. Even a comforting hand from a friend could cause panic. Others couldn't bear to look at wooden objects, or froze at the smell of ash. The sound of rhythmic counting, echoing the count of strikes, could send them into silent breakdowns. Many retreated into complete muteness, retreating inside themselves to escape their own bodies. The palace system was efficient because it was graduated. Surviving the first level of punishment meant living under constant fear of the next. Every woman who had endured 40 strikes knew that any future mistake would bring 60, and few survived beyond that. This fear turned them into their own jailers. They policed each other, betrayed friends, and reported small infractions just to avoid drawing attention. Some, desperate to control their own fate, attempted self-adjustment, stabbing or striking their own bellies with whatever they could find. But the palace treated even this as defiance. Survivors of self-mutilation were still subjected to official beatings for attempting to tamper with imperial property. In the records of the time, written in cold, detached medical language, there is no mention of screams or grief, only positive outcomes. Women rendered sterile, yet able to serve for many more years. The cruelty had been refined into policy. For some, the weight of such a life became unbearable. And so, in the shadows of the Forbidden City, a small group of palace women began to plan something unthinkable. They would strike back, not against a guard, not against a matron, but against the emperor himself. 16 women moved like shadows through the sleeping palace, their hands clutching silk ribbons and curtain cords, the only weapons they could acquire without drawing suspicion. It was October 1542, and the Forbidden City lay under a thin autumn fog. The plan had been months in the making. They communicated in glances and subtle gestures during group punishments, hid their tools in plain sight among decorative fabrics, and rehearsed their movements in secret. Their leader, Consort Duan, had been forced to watch her sister beaten to death for the crime of crying during an imperial assault. Tonight, the emperor would pay. Each woman carried her own scars into that night. Yong had endured adjustment, 3 times. Wang had been forced to nurse imperial infants while her own 2 children died. Lady Kui's body bore the marks of experimental tortures. Their traumas differed, but their purpose was the same: end the reign of the man who had authored them all. Their target, Emperor Jiajing, was notorious for nights of alchemical excess and sexual indulgence. They knew his habits: which tonics left him sluggish, which wines sent him into heavy sleep. Tonight, he lay in a drugged stupor, oblivious to the danger approaching. Security around the emperor focused on threats from outside the palace, not the women who washed his clothes and carried his chamber pots. The conspirators exploited this blind spot. The first guard post was bypassed by crawling below the soldiers' sight lines. The second was passed by timing their movements with the guards' tea breaks. The third post stood empty, its occupants gambling in a side room, confident that no threat could come from within. Inside, they found the emperor sprawled across his bed, mouth slightly open, utterly defenseless. They had practiced this moment endlessly, using rolled blankets as stand-ins for his body. Consort Duan would loop the silk around his throat while the others held his limbs still. The knot was designed to tighten with every struggle, a quiet and certain death. But in the darkness, hands shook. The loop that should have slid into a strangling knot instead became a fixed circle that refused to tighten. The silk brushed his neck. He stirred. Panic spread like fire. Some pulled hard, others froze. The cord tangled with the bed curtains. A porcelain vase toppled, shattering on the floor. The noise jolted the emperor fully awake. He thrashed, clawing at the loose cord, and began to shout. The women had seconds. A few ran. Others tried frantically to finish the job. Yong working at the knot, Lady Wang pressing a pillow to his face, but their lack of experience in killing betrayed them. The attack turned to chaos. The guards burst in to find the emperor red-faced but alive, surrounded by sobbing women clutching their makeshift weapons. The attempt had lasted less than 3 minutes. In the Forbidden City, failure meant annihilation, not just for the guilty, but for anyone connected to them. The interrogations began immediately. Torture was not for the sake of confessions. They had been caught in the act. It was to uncover a network. But the conspirators had chosen only women already crushed by the palace, those with no one left to lose. The circle remained small. The executions were designed as a spectacle. All 16 women were sentenced to the slow slicing, Ling Qi, in the palace courtyard, a death drawn out over 3 days. But before their own suffering began, they were made to watch their families die the same way. Mothers, sisters, daughters, even infant nieces, all condemned by association. The message was unmistakable. To raise a hand against the emperor was to doom your entire bloodline. In the aftermath, new restrictions descended like a net. Women were forbidden from gathering in groups. No fabric longer than a handspan could be kept in their possession. Even looking at curtain cords could arouse suspicion. The assassination attempt that might have ended their suffering instead deepened it. The emperor became paranoid beyond reason. He slept in a different bedchamber each night. He refused to trust any female servant. Even food and drink were tested by male eunuchs before reaching his lips. And in the months that followed, his suspicion and cruelty reached their peak, leading to a single morning when thousands of women would pay with their lives. The blood-soaked morning came in April of 1421. Nearly 3,000 women knelt in the Forbidden City's largest courtyard, backs straight despite the terror, bodies trained into perfect posture by years of discipline. They knew they would not leave alive. The order had come from Emperor Yongle himself. The official reason was a rumor, whispered that his favorite concubine had taken her own life, not from guilt over invented crimes, but because of his failure in the bedchamber. The insult to his pride was enough to condemn thousands. The killings were organized with military precision. Guards split the women into groups of 50, each assigned to an execution team. These men were practiced in Ling Chi, the death of 1,000 cuts, but today the method would be adapted for efficiency. The cuts would be fewer but deeper, ensuring death in hours instead of days. Multiply that by nearly 3,000, and the scale of the suffering became unfathomable. It began with sound. First, the low metallic whisper of blades being sharpened in unison. Then the synchronized thud of boots on stone as executioners took their positions, crushing the fallen cherry blossoms beneath their heels. The scent of the flowers mingled with the metallic tang of blood that had yet to fall. The chief executioner's voice carried across the courtyard as he read the charges: conspiracy to spread sedition, insult to the imperial dignity, collective treason against the dragon throne. The words barely mattered. The verdict had been sealed long before the women were assembled. Then the blades went to work. The silence drilled into these women during years of service cracked at last. Some cried out the names of children they would never see again. Others murmured fragments of Buddhist prayers. Many said nothing at all, their voices stolen long before by training and fear, dying as they had lived, in silence. By midday, the courtyard stones were hidden beneath a sheet of blood. Executioners rotated in and out, muscles exhausted from the sheer scale of slaughter. Corpses were dragged to the edges and stacked in grim piles, the stench of iron growing heavier with each passing hour. The emperor himself arrived at the height of the massacre, borne in a sedan chair. He remained only long enough to see the reality of his command, then returned to his chambers. Some accounts whisper he spent that night with new concubines, as if to prove his virility over the bodies of the dead. The killing stretched into the night. Torches threw shifting shadows across the courtyard, making the scene even more nightmarish. The last victim was said to be the youngest, a girl who had entered palace service only weeks earlier. She died calling for her mother, her voice fading to a thread before the blade silenced it. Within hours, the cover-up began. Bodies were hauled to great pits outside the city walls and burned. Their ashes were cast into the river, so no grave could become a place of mourning. The courtyard itself was scrubbed and rebuilt, every stone replaced, every trace of blood erased. New cherry trees were planted, their roots feeding on the remains buried deep below. But the erasure went further. Palace records were altered retroactively to claim these women had never existed. Families were told their daughters had died of illness, been sent to distant provinces, or chosen to retire into religious life. Anyone who pressed for truth was met with veiled threats until their questions stopped. An entire generation of palace women was wiped from the historical record with bureaucratic precision. Centuries later, the same courtyard would become a tourist attraction, famous for its cherry blossoms. Visitors would admire the beauty without knowing the ground beneath had once been drenched in human blood. In the official histories of China, the massacre never happened. And that was the point. The erasure of April 1421 was as deliberate as the massacre itself. In the Forbidden City, history could be rewritten not by truth, but by the emperor's command, and the machinery to do so was already in place. First came the destruction of all primary records. The Ministry of Internal Affairs kept meticulous logs of every palace worker: names, ages, places of origin, dates of service. These were gathered and burned in furnaces built to leave no readable scrap of ash. Then the secondary traces were removed. Payment rolls, food distribution lists, dormitory assignments, any document that hinted at the existence of those women, were altered or destroyed. To an outsider, the paper trail would show nothing unusual. But one woman, Lady Kui, had seen this coming. She was a senior palace official with rare access to the records. In the days before the executions, When whispers of an order began circulating, she began her own secret archive. She used materials so ordinary no one would think to confiscate them: sheets of poetry paper, lengths of painting silk. When the ink ran low, she mixed soot with her own blood, ensuring the record could not be easily erased. The official historians faced a delicate task. Simply removing records would leave suspicious gaps. Instead, they rewrote reality. The women who died were reassigned on paper to provincial palaces, or returned home for marriage. Death dates were scattered across decades. The courtyard where they had been executed was renamed a meditation garden. Its freshly turned earth explained away as landscaping. The work went beyond documents. Personal belongings of the victims, clothing, jewelry, letters from home, were collected and burned. The execution ground itself was remade. The soil dug out to a depth of 6 feet, the paving stones replaced, cherry trees planted to mask the past with blossoms. But memories are harder to kill. Other palace women still remembered. They whispered names in the dark, passed fragments of stories to new arrivals, kept mental lists of the missing. Some claimed the number of dead was even higher, with more women dying in the days after the massacre from injuries or suicide. The Imperial censors moved to stamp out even these whispers. Palace women were forbidden from learning more than the few characters needed for inventory work. Those caught keeping personal writings faced the same punishments reserved for physical rebellion. Oral histories were fractured by reassigning women constantly, breaking up any groups that might preserve shared memory. Yet Lady Kui persisted. As her health failed, perhaps worsened by the blood she had used to write her secret records, she trained a successor, a younger woman whose own name would later be erased. The knowledge was passed like a smuggled treasure. The location of the hidden archive, the code within its verses, the meanings woven into its paintings. She used her funeral preparations as camouflage. In Chinese tradition, elderly servants prepared their own burial items in advance: poems for the afterlife, painted scrolls for their tomb. Lady Kui's death poems were testimonies of the women lost. Her afterlife paintings contained coded names and dates. The taboo against disturbing such objects was her shield. For centuries, the deception held. No official Chinese history recorded the massacre. Western scholars who later gained access to imperial archives found nothing but silence in the years surrounding 1421. The truth remained hidden until centuries later, when Lady Kui's funeral scrolls were discovered in a tomb, their delicate brushstrokes hiding the blood-written testimony of the women erased from history. Without her, the deaths of nearly 3,000 palace women would have been not just unmarked, but entirely forgotten. And so, after centuries of cruelty and control, everything circled back to that April morning in 1421, when nearly 3,000 women learned that their lives weighed less than a single man's pride. At sunrise on April 21st, they were herded into the great courtyard, arranged in perfect rows. Even with death minutes away, their postures were straight, their movements measured, the product of years of training that demanded flawless obedience. They were killed because of a rumor, one that wounded the emperor's vanity. A single whisper about his failings had been enough to justify a mass execution. The machinery of death was swift but not silent. Blades struck, bodies fell, and the women's discipline finally broke. Some cried the names of children they had not seen in years. Others clung to fragments of prayer. Many said nothing at all, conditioned into silence so deep that even at the end, they could not break it. By midday, the courtyard was a river of blood. The piles of bodies grew, hauled to the edges to make room for more. The air thickened with the stench of iron and smoke as incense burned, a futile attempt to mask the smell of death. Yongle himself appeared briefly, carried in his sedan chair. He stayed just long enough to witness the slaughter he had ordered, then retreated to his chambers. That night, he took new concubines, as if the massacre were proof of his strength. The killing went on into the night. Torches flared against the stone walls, casting shadows that writhed with every movement of the executioners. The final victim, they said, was a girl barely past childhood, in service only a matter of weeks. She died calling for her mother, her voice no louder than a thread. By dawn, the work of erasure had already begun. The bodies were burned in vast pits beyond the city walls, their ashes scattered into the river. The courtyard was stripped bare, the stones replaced, the soil dug deep to bury the past. New cherry trees were planted to hide the truth beneath beauty, and in the records, the women vanished. They were assigned new fates on paper, transferred to distant posts, married off, dead of illness. Families received these lies with bowed heads, because to question the emperor's word was to invite ruin. Today, tourists walk the same courtyard, cameras in hand, admiring the blossoms that bloom each spring. Guides speak of imperial grandeur, of the brilliance of Ming architecture. There is no plaque, no memorial, no official word that the greatest mass killing of women in Chinese history happened here. The silence is so complete that to even suggest it can sound like invention. The women who died left no portraits, no graves, no autobiographies. Their faces survive only in the coded verses and painted silk lady smuggled into her tomb, and in the inherited grief of those who somehow know, without ever having been told, that the blood of their ancestors lies in the roots beneath the cherry trees. History, after all, is not only written by the victors. It is written by those who decide which victims are allowed to be remembered. And these women, the so-called female eunuchs of China's imperial palace, were meant to be remembered by no one at all.